In a few moments, we will witness the story of the Titanic and its sinking process. At the moment of impact, you will see it from inside the ship. We will look at the real images of the iceberg that sank the Titanic and the mark it left on the ship. Then, through an experiment, we will learn what those who fell into the water experienced, and we will go after the truth. The sound you just heard belonged to the distress call sent from the Titanic. With the help of telegraph communication, calls for help were sent to other ships using Morse signals. The Titanic had begun to sink slowly. At the telegraph was a 25-year-old young man named Jack Phillips. He did not leave his post until the communication room was completely flooded. That young man acted heroically until the very last moment, but nothing he did worked. The Titanic would be found for the first time 73 years after it sank, and everything would begin with the discovery of the wreck, the mysterious story of the Titanic.
The great ship went down after striking an iceberg. Never a trace was found. That mystery was explained today. The Titanic is 2.5 miles beneath the surface. Scientists in a miniature submarine made the discovery early this morning. Mark Gage reports.
Wreckage. Bingo! Yeah!
And I went in, and there it was. The boiler was on the screen.
Oh, I love it, I love it!
Everything started many, many years ago, in 1912, exactly 111 years ago from today. In big letters, newspapers published the headline, "Titanic to begin its first voyage." The image of the ship and the ticket prices were also included in the newspaper. The story of the Titanic was, in fact, based on a challenge. The transatlantic passenger business was very profitable and innovative, competing to transport wealthy travelers and immigrants. Two companies were especially in competition. The White Star Line Company planned to build two ships that would break records while crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They wanted to respond to this challenge. But instead of making faster ships, they chose another path. In 1908, the company formed what was practically an army of workers, most of them Irish. In their minds was a revolutionary idea, to build the largest, most luxurious, and most comfortable passenger ship ever designed. "We may not be the fastest," they said, "but who would want to travel across the ocean vomiting all the way?" That was their motto. Their goal was to dominate travel between Europe and America within 5 years. Eventually, the massive RMS Olympic was launched, the largest ship the world had ever seen at that time. This 45,000-ton ship had the capacity to carry 1,000 passengers. Shortly after, the company would launch another ship, the real center of attention, RMS Titanic. About 14,000 people worked on the construction of the Titanic. When it was time to launch it into the water, 200,000 people gathered to watch. Those who saw it said that it felt as though the ground was moving, not the ship. For the people of that time, this was an enormous ship. Even the Titanic's anchors weighed 15 tons each. The interior of the ship was decorated with the most luxurious and expensive furnishings. Some people thought that instead of spending money on luxury, they should have invested more in technology. Because at that time, ships with 4 propellers and higher maneuverability were being built. But the White Star Line did not want the Titanic to stand out for its technology. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic was ready to set off from England on its first voyage. Its destination was New York City. The ship, under the command of Captain Smith, departed from England at noon. It would first go to the French port of Cherbourg, then to Queenstown, now Cobh, and from there to New York. As the ship left the port, operators were warned that there could be icebergs along the southern route. These were warnings they were used to hearing. In the Atlantic Ocean, such alerts were usually taken lightly. At 9:30 p.m., a ship called Mesaba, which was ahead of the Titanic, reported seeing large icebergs along its route. But although the warning was received by the telegraph operators Phillips and Herald, it was never delivered to the captain, because at that time, they were busy sending messages for the first-class passengers. Telegrams to people waiting for them in New York, which was considered the fastest way to socialize at that time. The weather suddenly grew colder. It was as if the cold breath of death was somewhere nearby. The sea was calm, smooth like glass. On the Titanic, there were lookout points known as the Crow's Nest. 2 lookouts would change shifts with another to every 2 hours. It was almost midnight. The ship was sailing south of the Grand Banks. One of the lookouts saw something ahead of the ship. Something he couldn't clearly identify because it was so dark, but it was an iceberg. Lookout Frederick Fleet rang the ship's bell 3 times and called the bridge. The first officer, Murdoch, gave the order, hard to starboard. That meant to turn the ship's wheel sharply in one direction. Even though the ship's speed was only 40 kilometers per hour, it was impossible to stop that enormous mass in time. Just 37 seconds later, at 11:40 p.m. the ship struck the iceberg on its starboard right-hand side. The iceberg cut through the ship like a razor. Many points along the hull bent under the pressure, and rivets beneath the waterline burst, causing 5 compartments to fill with water. Captain Smith called the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, and asked for a report on the damage. When Thomas went below to inspect the compartments, he saw his worst fear realized. -1 compartments were taking on water at a rate of 400 tons per minute. The ship was no longer savable. They had to accept that it was doomed. All they could do now was abandon ship as quickly as possible. Captain Smith ordered that women and children should board the lifeboats first. Before going to bed, the Californian's operator, Evans, sent a message to the Titanic: "We are stopped by ice, be careful." But the Titanic's operator, Phillips, was so overwhelmed with messages that he replied, "Shut up, I am busy working right now." A short while later, Captain Smith personally came and ordered, "Send a distress signal immediately." The operators could reach any ship within a 400-mile range. The Californian, just 32 kilometers away, didn't respond. Minutes later, the ship Carpathia replied. But it was very far away. They were told to contact another nearby ship. Eventually, they received a response from the Carpathia, which began heading toward them. According to calculations, it would take 4 hours for the Carpathia to arrive. But they had only 2 hours left. They realized no help would arrive in time. The front part of the ship was completely flooded, and the rear began lifting into the air. Passengers were awakened immediately and told to evacuate. Panic filled the ship. One of the most urgent tasks now was to send a distress call. In times of danger, more signals were sent to nearby ships. But the telegraph operators, who during the voyage had been handling messages from wealthy first-class passengers to their families and friends, and charging them for it, didn't want to bother with ordinary messages. During the voyage, various warnings had been received from other ships. For example, the Californian, sailing further north, had been unable to continue because of heavy ice that evening, and decided to stop for the night. Meanwhile, on the Californian, an officer saw rockets being fired from the Titanic, and informed Captain Lord at 1:15 a.m. Captain Lord wondered if the rockets were a distress signal. These flares were used for identification and illumination, but because of poor maritime regulations at the time, he was confused. He couldn't tell whether they were emergency signals or not. He ordered his crew to keep watching and to continue sending Morse messages to other ships. Then he went back to bed. At 1:50 a.m. 3 more rockets were fired from the Titanic. From the Californian, they noticed something strange. The ship's stern was rising at a 45-degree angle. At 2:15 a.m. the Titanic disappeared from sight. At 5:30 a.m. the Californian's operator tried to contact Phillips. Not knowing that Phillips was now resting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. That night, the Californian had been only 32 kilometers away. Right beneath them, people were screaming for help, freezing to death. But because of a foolish captain and his officer, they could do nothing. The Titanic had struck the iceberg around midnight, and completely sank by 2:20 a.m. in the early morning. One of the ships that had set out reached the area. Some of the lucky ones who had survived were rescued. In footage taken from one of the rescue ships, you can see the iceberg that sank the Titanic and the marks of impact. Looking at the fractures on the iceberg, you can clearly see where the ship had passed. And this was the Carpathia. If its captain had taken the warning signals seriously and arrived sooner, perhaps hundreds more could have been saved. After the sinking, there were still people alive on the surface. But the real suffering would now begin for those left behind. Dr. Mike, an expert in harsh survival conditions, decided to demonstrate through an experiment what actually killed those who fell into the freezing water that night. First, the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean water, the same as where the Titanic sank in 1912, was set to 12 degrees Celsius. It's usually 5 to 6 degrees colder, but for safety, it was set higher. A volunteer's hand strength and dexterity were tested first. Then, using a thermal camera, his body temperature was measured. Next, the volunteer was slowly immersed into the icy water. The sudden drop in skin temperature immediately activated cold receptors. The central nervous system detected the danger and tried to warm the body by triggering involuntary movements. That's why we shiver when we're cold. After about 20 minutes, the volunteer began to shake violently from the cold. He had to be taken out of the water immediately, otherwise, he would have died of hypothermia. On the thermal camera, the results were shocking. His skin looked as cold as metal. After leaving the water, his hand strength dropped by about 40%. Those who fell into the Atlantic from the Titanic likely died painfully within half an hour. It's known that the Titanic struck an iceberg, and for many years, no other cause was considered. People thought the ship was unsinkable. The iceberg had sliced the hull like a razor. So, had cheap materials been used in the ship's construction? In the early 1900s, steel was still relatively new, and there were difficulties in its production. In the Titanic, especially in the forward hull sections, old-fashioned iron rivets were used. These rivets were inserted between two steel plates and secured by melting the outer ends, essentially gluing the two plates together. Tests showed that these rivets were strong, meaning the ship shouldn't have sunk from a simple side impact. So how did water get in? Something had been overlooked. The rivets were strong enough to withstand most damage, but the impact wasn't a direct hit, it was a scraping collision. As the Titanic brushed along the iceberg, the mushroom-shaped, outward-facing rivets were torn off one by one. This created a 9-meter-long tear in the hull. In other words, the Titanic didn't collide head-on, it scraped the iceberg. If it had struck from another angle, it likely would not have sunk. But the process had begun long before that night. That day was strange in every way. There was no moon, and the sea was unnaturally calm. Researcher Tim Malton said that rapid weather changes in the area had created an optical illusion. The sky was clear, but the horizon was blurred. This made the iceberg much harder to spot. Because of this, the lookouts likely didn't notice the iceberg until it was only about 1 kilometer away. It's often said that the Titanic's lookouts didn't have binoculars that night. But even if they had, it might not have helped. Humans first detect distant objects with the naked eye, and only then use binoculars to observe them. So even with binoculars, it's unlikely they would have seen it sooner. Every year, an ocean current called the Labrador Current flows from Greenland toward the coasts of Canada and the northern United States. It carries icebergs that break off from Greenland's glaciers. The iceberg that struck the Titanic had likely broken off 300 days earlier, traveling for months across the ocean, until it reached that very spot. By fate, an iceberg formed thousands of years earlier. From compacted snow, weighing 1.5 million tons, was hiding in the dark that night, waiting to send the Titanic to the depths of the Atlantic. About 2 hours after it sank, around 5:30 a.m., the sun rose, and the survivors looked back to see what had destroyed them. About 1,500 people had died, mostly men and lower-class passengers. Captain Smith was among them. This had been his final voyage before retirement, but instead, he retired from life itself. It's impossible to describe what happened. Just 3 hours earlier, people were chatting in their rooms. Parents had tucked their children into bed with a kiss. And 3 hours later, those same mothers would hand their frozen children to the cold ocean waters. Fathers watched as their families slipped away from their grasp. Some wives became widows, and some children would never forget that night.
That was that. She stopped. We had a porthole open, and I looked out, and the sky was clear, the stars were shining, the sea was dead calm. And I thought, I don't know, I couldn't understand it. So I came out of my cabin, and I thought, oh, I'd go forward. And I went forward to the well deck on the starboard side, and I could see ice in the well deck. There's no sign of Iceberg then, because she'd passed us. And the lights were shining on the water from the portholes, and no sign of damage above waterline. And of course, what had happened, we slipped over the iceberg. First boats were away on the port side. The first boats away didn't have many passengers on board. They were afraid to go down. There was a 70-foot drop to the water, and they didn't think she was going to sink. And she was sinking fast then. And all of a sudden, she lifted up quickly, and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her. And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave, and now I'll go, and I dropped in. I had a lifeboat on, and I hit the water with a terrific crack. Luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. There were bodies all over the place. And then I looked up at the Titanic. So the propellers were right out of water, the rudder was right out, and I could see the bottom. And then gradually she glided away, and that was that. That was the last of the Titanic. I didn't want to die. I mean, I didn't see much chance of living, but I was gradually getting frozen up. And by the grace of God, I came across a lifeboat, and they pulled me in.
I believe you've even got a watch that you were wearing at the time when you went into the water.
Yes, yes. No, I couldn't afford anything better in those early days. Yes.
Behind this short story of the Titanic lie countless unknowns. In the next part, we will look at Lord Mersey's reports and experiments, the real traces of the Titanic's impact with the iceberg, and incredible images of the wreck itself. Don't forget to reserve your seat for part 2. And take just 2 seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel.